Today's lecture, we're very proud to present Dr. Larry Davis. He's Dean. He's the Donald M. Henderson Professor, and he is also Director of the Center for Race and Social Problems at the School of Social Work for the University of Pittsburgh. And he will be talking about race and racism, training today's leaders, training today's social work leaders for today's challenges. Okay, you know when you try to memorize, whatever. We are more than delighted, and this event is co-sponsored by the DSW Committee and Program, as well as the Social Justice and Diversity Committee and Initiatives. And the two directors of that are Courtney O'Mealy and Dr. Gina Nastis. So we're delighted, and it's in celebration of Black History Month. And what I'd like to do is introduce our introducer, who needs no introduction, Dean Lynn McVeigh. Dean, I'm sorry. You know what? I'm really nervous about this. Dean Lynn Videcka. I collaborate with someone at Tisch named Lynn McVeigh. Dean Lynn Videcka. So please, Lynn.
Thank you. By any other name, right? All right. It's such an honor and pleasure to have Larry Davis here with us today to talk about some of his work and to lead a discussion with us, which I know he'll do. And Carol gave you Larry's current position as Dean at the University of Pittsburgh and Donald Henderson Professor. I want to say that the Center on Race and Social Problems in 2009, when I first came to NYU and you had that big national conference, and I want to say that the Center on Race and Social Problems is a very unique and a singular center across the entire United States and across every field of thought that is interested in social equality and the issues of race in America. You've built something really terrific, and our whole field and our whole nation has benefited from the line of inquiry that you have been so committed to, Larry. Larry has his PhD in psychology and social work from the University of Michigan. He was a faculty member for many years at the Washington University Brown School, where our own Mary McKay is going on to be the next dean. And Larry is an eminent social work scholar, and among his many distinctions, he's a member of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. I've been, before I ever met Larry in person, and not since 1989, I've been using Larry's books, and this still stands as a really good book about race, gender, and class in social work practice. And what I thought from the time I read this book to the time I read his current book today is that Larry really blends the voices of an activist and someone who's really committed to social change, of a scholar who's deeply rooted in the best social science traditions, and as a concerned citizen who wants the best for our society and our nation. So we're so honored to have you here, Larry, today. And I said to him earlier, I want to let everyone know, we hope this isn't the last time he comes here. This will just be the first time he comes here. So ladies and gentlemen, I bring you Larry Davis.
Thank you. Thank you also very much for coming. I'm going to just say some formal things. Pardon me for sneezing and all kinds of things I'm going to do up here. So, I used to live in New York, so this isn't a strange place to me. In fact, I want to come back to New York. That's what she's talking about. I want to come back to New York for sabbatical, or longer. Anyway, let me say this thing so I can get this out of the way, because I really, I want to thank you. I want to thank the Dean, Dean Videcka, and the DSW Program Director, Carol, for inviting me and letting me join you today. I've never really been so torn as to what to tell a group as this group. I've had 3 talks for you. I've gotten rid of most of them. I have one long formal talk, which is preparing practitioners. I don't have you long enough for that. You know, it's funny what's happening with me now is that I have so much I can talk about that it's really a problem. I mean, you know, what do I say? I have you guys for 45 minutes. I have some practitioners in here. I have some researchers in here. I have some scholars in here, young people in here, more seasoned people in here. And you all sort of have different sort of questions and different issues. I've been traveling around quite a bit always, actually, but even more so lately, doing things with the book. And just generally. And what I find that the best thing I can offer places is really a dialogue. What people really want is a place, the center does, the center in St. Louis, Pittsburgh does this, a safe place to have a dialogue about race, discussion. What can we talk about? Why is the world this way, and what might we do about it? Rather than me giving a really scripted piece, I'm going to try and paraphrase some of what I would say, why we got here. Then I can talk about other things you guys are going to talk about. I can talk about the book, not to sell it. I mean, that's great if you buy it. That's great. But the book has, I've been well trained in theory. In that book that you pointed out, The Race Engine Class, was really my social work prelim. I did it with Norma Radin and Charles Garvin. I knew I had I've had great people. I really have had great people. So I have all this theory that I've been able to use in my life. That book isn't so dissimilar to this book. It is somewhat, but theory allows you to transcend situation. And I say to you in the doctoral program, learn as much theory as you possibly can, because the situation will change, but the theory will allow you to change with it. So let me say what the first couple of things I'll say. How do we get here? I'll say a couple of things. What's my title? This is okay. It says Training Social Work Leaders. All right. And I start off with something that would say, you know, like, how do we sort of get here? There are 2 things that are going on in America presently at the same time, which together are disastrous. One, you have a major demographic shift going on in the country, right? When I started talking about race in 1960, 80% of the U.S. population was white in 1960. By 2016, that number had dropped to 65%. So we really have a country that is really going through a major demographic change. Some people aren't feeling it. In New York, you probably don't feel it as much because you've always been back to the future. You are what the future looks like here, D.C., places like that. This is how the world's going to look, but most of the world isn't ready for this look. Places out in Wyoming, you know, places, the rest of the country, California, maybe some places. The country's not ready for this look. And that you have someone like your famous Trump guy here, right? He says, you know, we're gonna, you know, people say not so much Trump. It isn't just Trump. If he wasn't you can't blame it all on him. We will make America great again, or we want our country back. You know, sometimes you have to ask back to what? You know, and what they're thinking about back is back into the 50s, I think. You know, they want to go back. They want a demographic change. They want to change back to a redistribution of resources. You know, I talk more about resources than I used to. Now, I gave a talk in D.C. a couple weeks ago. Some of you may have heard. Does anyone at that talk? You were, a couple of you were, yeah. Thanks. And I use all these. I got to talk to you guys there, too. I had all these kind of stories. One thing about getting old, you have all these stories. I like that a lot. And one of my favorite stories now is to tell the stories about Raising the Sun. You know, Lorraine Hansberry book, a play called Raising the Sun. And the line I like in it so much is, I should go back and hear exactly what the mom said, but anyway, the son and the mom were having this dispute, right? He wanted to buy this liquor store, and he needed money, and it was about money, and he and his mom were going around, and And she said to me, doing something like, during my time, it was about social justice and issues like that. And now it's all about money. It's all about money. And he said, it was always about money, Mama. We just didn't know it. And I think that's true. I think it was always about money. I could talk to you about another topic. I've become enamored with slavery, which I think I have to say there's so much I could actually talk to you about. I told you, Dean, on the break that I really, I was sorry I had you such a short time. Because I wish I had you in different groups, and even smaller groups. I wish I had the faculty, because there are faculty issues, the racial issues that come up in class. There are racial issues between faculty members, believe it or not. There are racial issues in the city, in the country. We can talk about it. Not that I have all the answers, but at least I'm prepared to talk. I've thought about some of them, and we can talk about them. We can do a better job. But most of us don't have a forum. That's mainly what the center does. It provides a forum every month. That isn't just Black History Month. It's every month. There are summer institutes. There are ways that we have to sort of talk about this. So anyway, so a couple of things are happening, as I said. One is this tremendous demographic shift. I've had but one original idea in my life, really only one. And I developed it really around with a guy named Ted Newcomb. I had a marvelous education. The older I get, I didn't think much at the time, but I really did. Some of you probably know who Ted Newcomb is, but anyway, he was this little wiry Jewish guy about this tall, and he published articles that came out when he was dead. Articles were still coming out. He was the model for me, really. I wanted to be Ted Newcomb. I wanted to be some kind of Ted Newcomb and Kenneth Clark. I don't know, some kind of combination of something. But anyway, I developed this idea. I had an idea, but I never got backing for it. And the idea was that I had noticed in the literature something called white flight. And what fascinated me about it was a nonlinear function. It was where, as a percent of blacks went into a neighborhood or a school or something, went like this, and then it got to around 30%, and then it did an it took off, right? It was nonlinear. It just didn't keep going up like this. It got to some place, and then you really had a flight pattern. And we knew about it. We've known about it for forever. But we really never knew why 30%. What was it with 30%? Why do that number? So anyway, I conjured this hypothesis that it was basically, I did my dissertation and stuff around it, but I never got funding. I never got funding for it. But the argument I was making is that most of you would compose a group, would think nothing of composing a group with 5 whites and 1 black in it. Most of you would have considerable reservation to composing a group with maybe I said 5 whites, 5 whites and 1 black in it, but you have considerable thought thinking about composing a group with 5 blacks and 1 white in it. You know there's a difference. Those groups are psychologically very different. And what I used to draw on the board when I taught this was that 5 and 5 are not equal. That basically, I argued that whites are so accustomed to being in the majority that around 30% they become to feel themselves in the minority. And even though the minority is still the numerical minority, they have become the psychological majority. That was the only original idea I really had. I never could get, it was too early. Country people didn't want to fund it. I probably could get it funded today. But anyway, so I wanted to do it with small groups. I wanted one in the military. I had all kinds of small group designs I wanted to do with it. I wanted to know what leadership did with that. So anyway, but that's where the country is in some respects today. We were approached this sort of white flight pattern. So it's sort of 30% and 30, 70%, and you're getting a pushback. Whether my theory is correct doesn't matter. We're getting a pushback. So we're really having some issues about that. It becomes to whose school is it, whose neighborhood is it, whose country is it. So we're getting big fights around this topic. The second thing that's going on that makes this particularly problematic time is that we're also, no one likes to say we're in economic decline. But I'm from Michigan. We make cars. General Motors, the whole state made cars. Those jobs have never come back. You know, when we came out of World War II, everybody else was in shambles. The Japanese were in shambles. The Germans were in shambles. China wasn't even making cars. So America didn't have much competition. But now everybody makes cars. I haven't personally owned an American car in 30 years. You know, I've either owned a Japanese car or a German car or some kind of hybrid or something or other. So those jobs have to come from someplace, you know. And people think, you know, that often American workmen think that the group that some of the rights appeals to, that someone took those jobs. But no one, they were never their jobs. They were jobs. And whether you like capitalism or not, I'm not defending it. I think it's fine. I don't know. But whatever you think about, that's not the point. The point is that the goal of capitalism is to make money. That I have a product, I want to sell it as cheaply as I can and make money. Right? I mean, that's to make it as cheaply as I can and make money. That's the goal. So why would I pay you $20 an hour and I can pay her $2 an hour? My goal is to make money. I mean, I'm not in this. You know, slavery was an instance where we took, I said this at the meeting I think in D.C. Slavery was an instance where we took labor to the job. Crude way to put that. We brought millions of people to work to the job. Now we do it the other way around. Now we take the job to the people. So those jobs, it made sense that those jobs would leave. I mean, you know, why? Why would you produce something at a higher cost? It doesn't make sense. So it's never going to come back like that. I mean, we may create some kind of something. You know, one time, America's 5% of the world's population. We consume about 25% of the world's resources. It's an untenable position. You can't do that forever. Everybody wants their share now. Everyone wants a bite now. So we have increasing diversity and, in some respects, increasing competition for resources. So it's a real volatile mix that we have going. So people feel that they've been mistreated. You know, I say this in a book someplace in here. I don't know which chapter it was in here. But that it has to do with people feeling, you know, actually it's relative deprivation is what it is, but that's not, I use the term there some, but it's that if you've had all the chairs, and now I say, well, you know, you have to share the chairs, you'll feel relatively deprived. And that's kind of what's happening, you know, that before, some people had all the chairs. And now here are other people at the table. Women at the table now. Mexicans, black people, all kind of people running around wanting to sit at the table. Well, you know, so even the Supreme Court looks different than it did in the 50s, you know. So you can't, you know, so you have a really different, you have a real serious, you know, you have a scarcity of resources and greater competition among various groups for those resources. So I think it's the worst case scenario. And what I say to you guys is that if I give this in a more formal way, you have these I think the figures that people have about the disparities, you know, most of us know them. I mean, the country has, you know, how's it go? The top 10th of 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. You know, you hear Bernie Sanders say these quotes all the time. And the bottom 40% combined for poultry, 0.3% of the population. I mean, we have a huge, huge skew now. Well, it's getting worse. In fact, Chris Rock says, if the poor people knew how rich the rich people really were, there'd be riots in the streets. And that's probably the case. The Walton family, for example, has more wealth than 42% of the American families combined. One family has 42% of all the wealth of all the families in the country. So it's unimaginable wealth. Well, that doesn't help. That doesn't help. So you guys, we guys are going to have our hands full. Maybe we shouldn't have our hands full. I don't know. Maybe we should step back. I don't know. But we do. As you know, black Americans have only 1/10 the net wealth of whites. And, basically, I think I put it sometimes that blacks have a nickel, Hispanics have 6 or 7 cents. The shocking thing, though, is that 35% of black households have zero or negative net worth. Zero or negative net worth, a third of all black households. That means they have no tangible investment in society. So you got nothing to lose there. You got an interesting kind of group of people running around. New York, for New York City, you have the median, the highest income, of course, it's whites. It's about 75,000. For the lowest is Hispanics, is 36,000. So anyway, the point is we have these tremendous disparities, and we have a problem. And as social workers, a lot of this is going to fall to us, really, to address these things. Our clients are going to be poor. You're going to see more white poverty than we've seen, which is going to be interesting. So I think you need to prepare yourself for these both class and race discussions. A friend of mine who's a newscaster, who's a columnist in Pittsburgh says the only thing Americans hate more talking about than class is race. So you're going to have a lot of these discussions in your courses. I really would like to help you have these discussions, prepare you for these discussions. What do you say? When we did some of this with the NAD group, National Association of Deans and Directors. What happens when a student says this? That's what I'm saying. I have several conversations going here. You know, there's some for faculty, sort of, and some for students, sort of, and some for practitioners. So what do you say when someone does something? Anyway, we need to be better versed in the conversations about race. Let me say a little bit about this book because it'll help us talk a little bit. This picture, how would I have this topic? Does anyone know the answer to this? Probably someone does in here. I've had enough PR about it. Anyone read this book? One person. Okay, good. Then I can talk about it. Part by sniffing. It's funny. Just I don't really know. I'm not going to tell you that. I wish I had you all day. The title of the book, which is why I want to use it. When I was about 7 years old, I remember where I was because we were in our old neighborhood. I asked myself, pardon me, if we were slaves, why are they angry with us? Reasonable question for a 7-year-old, huh? Reasonable question for a 30-year-old. And it stayed with me. I don't know why it came up. I don't know what I was doing in the household. My family was, I don't know. But I remember exactly where I was. Walking on the street. I remember exactly. It was a sunny, bright Saturday afternoon. And I remember having the thought, and it never sort of really, it was just sort of a thought I had. But if we were slaves, why are they angry with us? I was well into my doctoral education before I answered the question satisfactorily for me. Why is that? This doesn't seem right. We should be angry. What are they angry about? Right? Well, again, that's why theory was so very important in terms of my own life. So this book is the most personal book I've written. This book is really sort of a personal book of race and social science. It's a series of essays, 8 essays. The titles are things like titles. I think I know what they are, but I don't. Things like whites in the family, which I'll talk about in a minute. Whites in the family, why are they angry with us? Internalized racism, the exodus from paradise. Maybe I should say what they are. Whites in the family. I'll read them all first. Why can't blacks be like immigrants? Now, this is the one someone saw. You saw it, but did you say you saw it too? Someone read it? The newspaper took and serialized this part in my hometown, in Pittsburgh. Why can't blacks be like immigrants? Common question. People would say, well, why don't blacks be like the immigrants? Do you know anybody in prison? That has to do really with social equity, and people will often ask of people, how come you're black and you made it? Why didn't the other guys make it? And then there's something about racial identity when I talk about how racial identity in America. But let me do the first one here a little bit. Although we don't have to talk about that too much because I really like to talk about some other things. But this picture was taken about 1923. The little girl here, the little white-looking girl, is my mom. And the question was, how did she get in this black family? Right? When you picked the book up, you probably wouldn't notice it. You probably wouldn't see it. But what I talk about is sort of a legacy of sort of race in America, how America has sort of dealt with it. And anyway, I won't ruin the story for you. How she got in the family. She's not the last one in the family. So she didn't come the last one. She became somewhere in the middle of it. And implications for that, and this took place in Alabama, 1923. So sometimes I just want to say to you that you are trying to address a problem with a real long history. This is not, I've been enamored with slavery as of the last, I don't know, a couple years. As I said in D.C., that it dawned on me one day that slavery took place for 246 years in the country. 2.5 centuries. Now, that's more time you can get your head around. You're born in it, you're in it. Even if you live to be 100, you wouldn't see the other side. And we sort of treated in our history as a country, the country has been a slave country longer than a free country. Most of the millionaires at one time lived along the Mississippi. The money which the founding fathers fought the British with was slave money. At one time, the most valuable thing in the country were slaves. Slaves at the time of slavery ran about $700 a piece, which is about almost $20,000 today. So to buy a slave was a pretty major purchase. Less than 20% of whites owned slaves, but everybody benefited from it. But anyway, so this isn't like the civil rights movement. This isn't like this, the Vietnam War, which is 13 years, or World War II, or World War I. No, this is another whole ballgame. You're talking 2.5 centuries. Wow. I mean, every time I get in this discussion, I got into discussion because I take a group of students to Cuba every year. And I got into discussions with people. They would talk about slavery and Haiti and places. And only 6% of the slaves came to America. Only 6% of the slaves came to America. Most of them went someplace else. There's a project that I have now that I really don't know. I think I spoke to you about it, Michael. I don't know if I have the energy to do it. It's a huge undertaking if we do it. The conference that your dean spoke about a moment ago was a conference we did in 2010, actually. It was 2010. It was called Race in America. It cost $500,000 to put it on. It was the largest conference on race ever put on in America. It was a big deal. This one's bigger than that if we do it. But you almost need not to be dean, though. You know what I mean? It's such a task. It needs to hire somebody. Basically, it's called the legacy of slavery. And I'm not a historian per se, but I would like to talk about how the legacy of slavery manifests itself in the Western Hemisphere today. See, we think of this phenomenon as being Alabama. I do anyway, as being parochial sort of outfit. It was local guys. No. This was big business. There are two things I wanted from this conference if I do it. And if I hear somebody does it someplace, that's fine with me. I just want it done. One, the longevity of it. That most Americans, if you walk up to them and ask them, how long did slavery take place? I don't know, 40, 150 years. They don't know. They don't think anything about it. And they don't put it in some kind of context. 250 or 246 years, where is that? What would that do to a people coming out of the other side of that? Who would those people be? And what made American, there's one chapter in here called The Enemy Within. And there I use a lot of Lewin's work and other people who talked about the difference between blacks and Jews with regards to being ghettoized. Is that what really made American slavery different, so drastically different? I'm not even sure that the Hebrews were enslaved much longer than these guys were, than the black Americans were enslaved. But the difference is that other groups were enslaved as a group. Blacks were enslaved, if you can imagine, as individuals. That there was no connection between the people who were enslaved. In fact, it was intentionally broken down between the individuals who were enslaved. So they never had, when I sort of asked people So they never carried a common culture through. They never carried a culture through this experience, which is what allowed people to often survive terrible experiences. So you had this, you figure if you did this for 246 years, and on the other side, what made them different was the enemy, most ghettoized populations or colonized populations, the enemy is on the outside. August Wilson said, black people are the only people in the world who don't pray to a God that looks like them. You can't imagine having a sign up in a Korean community or a Jewish community or any community that says, buy Korean or buy Jewish. Someone would look at you, why would I not? But that was the deal that had to happen with black communities. It's a very different population. It had a very different history. The civil rights movement took place, it was trying to do a couple things. It was trying to change the relationship that blacks had with America, but it was also trying to change the black Americans had with themselves. So that's why you had Black is Beautiful, by Black. You had this whole cultural renaissance, which you would not have, not only was it a renaissance, because they didn't come back from someplace, it was a really restructuring. I mean, it really is the first time it really sort of happened. And it changed Black America greatly in terms of just the visibility, how people looked, how they looked, who their prom queens and kings were. I mean, it had a pervasive phenomenon. The average white person has no idea about this. No idea. They don't know. They said, if you're going to read this book, read one chapter, read The Internalized Racism, The Enemy Within. That it'll tell you why it works. And Lewin, in this book, he wrote it in the chapter called Internalized Racism Among Jews. Or maybe just maybe use self-hatred among Jews. But in any case, but then he said the worst case he'd ever seen of this was Black Americans. That he sort of talked about that, and he gave I use the passages. He gave the difference between the two groups and why they look like they do. So you see, there's a lot I could really talk to you about, and some of it's macro, and then some of it's quite micro. You know, why do we relate to people like we do? The book that you're talking about, the Race Engine Class book, is really micro theories about why we like people, why we don't, how do you get along with people. I wrote a bestseller once. It was called Black and Single. We sold 50,000 copies the first year. But it was that theory. It was the same theory for that book. It was, I came here from New York at the time. I did the Donahue show. I probably wasn't quite, that's how old I am. But it was driven by two theories, attraction theory and social exchange theory. But in either case, it's so the same theory, the same theory that makes you a better therapist is the same theory that worked for relationships. The outcome, the goals were different, but what was driving it was very similar. We don't buy things from people we don't like. We don't learn well from people we don't like. We tend not to marry or date people we don't like unless they have lots of money. All right? You have enough money, you can get along. So that's true. So the attraction theory is so very, very important. And just to do a micro thing for that, it's very important that you are able to establish some relationships with your clients. It's just so important that you can do that. And how do you do that? There are ways to do that. There are ways to think about that. We all have these things. We think about different sort of people. You know, three things. I'll say this and I'll stop. I guess I'll stop. There are three things that you run into when you run into a difference. This phenomenon, I call it the phenomenon of difference. I outlined it there in that book, but I never blew it up. I never wrote a real piece with it. But one, people will ask you, are you a person, when you run into this client who's different race than you, or different class than you, or different gender than you, or different sexual orientation, whatever it is, they're different than you. They're going to ask a couple questions. One, they're going to ask, are you a person of goodwill? And they'll look at you and they say, well, you know, it seems like she's okay, you know, she seems nice enough, all right. You'll probably get by that one because you're a social worker. The second question they'll ask is, do you have a sufficient mastery of the topic? Now, you'll probably get by this one in most instances, but the article I never wrote on this was that women and minorities will come in differently, that minorities are often perceived to be incompetent until proven otherwise. So going into a server situation, I get questions like this. I don't get them so much now, but I get questions. Nolan and I used to talk about it. We did a nice tape on this. People will say, well, where'd you go to school? Where's the real therapist? Anyway, you get the idea. Right? So you'll get that. They'll question your competence. Now white males will get challenged on the first one more. Are you a person of goodwill? Right? Women and minorities may get by on that one sooner. So what happens is this matrix. Each of us goes into these therapeutic situations with a sort of different liability. But the last one is the third one it really has to do, it's the most important one. It's social reality. And that the client will ask the question, do you understand my social reality well enough so that the advice that you offer is appropriate for my world? That you're a nice person, you know what you're doing, but you really don't know what it is to be me. Please respond to me differently than I respond to you. And that doesn't happen to you, so how can you teach me to get ready for that when you don't know what that looks like? So that's the real biggie. In fact, it's really about the third one. They're really trying to teach you to prepare you for the third one. You can't learn everything everywhere. You can't learn all the cultures and all that stuff. So there's some basic things. Anyway, you can see I really could talk to you about some practice stuff. That's on the micro end of it. But I really do have a grander sense of this macro thing and that how this got here. This is a 400-year problem. And you're not going to walk in anybody's workshop and come out solving it in an afternoon, if ever. So why don't I stop a minute and let you guys maybe ask some questions about anything you want. I don't know the answer, but you can ask it. Yeah.
So talk about a myriad of lot of different things. However, the title of the book is Why Are They Mad at Us?
Why are they angry with us? Exactly.
So I was wondering, in your book, are you able to give kind of a synopsis or a summary of the answer to that question?
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell you. No, right now I actually kind of joking, but I'm not joking. Yeah, it was like, why is this the case? And I sort of answer it, and what I tried to do with the book a little bit was to use myself as a vehicle. Really, it's not an autobiographical book. I use myself. I do tell, I did this and this happened and I did this, but it's really I use myself to talk about some events, some phenomena that took place, and trying to answer that phenomenon as to why. For example, the one about I critique resiliency in the book a little bit. Those of you who know resiliency stuff, and what I say about resiliency, I was always unhappy with resiliency ever since I've ever heard of it. And what the bottom line when I critique it in here is that people like me being this black dean, are often used to beat down less successful blacks. People will say to them, well, you did it. You're living proof it can be done. Why can't Joe go out? Why can't he be like you? I hit the lottery. The odds of my being here, I say this all the time, are astronomical. Astronomical that I should be sitting here before you talking. And I tell one story in the book where we were stopped by the police one night, only about 12, and we were like in a park. And we were trying to hit a sign with some rocks. We weren't having much luck. But we didn't do anything to it anyway. I mean, it's a sign. Police rolled around the corner, saw us. We saw the cop. Oh God, we gotta get out of here. Get in the car. He put us in the car. Drive us around for about 2 hours, and he called into the station. I got 2 kids. I want to bring them to the juvenile home. And the guy said, they're full. There's no room. So he let us go. Who knows where I'd be today? No stern warnings. No say, hey, listen, you No more throwing rocks in the park. Where do you live? I'm taking you home. No. You're behind us going to jail. You got 12-year-old kids. So, no, that's all. So, anyway, that's not quite how the resiliency piece came up. But the chapter that sort of says, do you know anybody in prison? Nola Proctor asked me that question. She doesn't know that. She's never seen this book. I don't think. But we were in a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine. We were standing in her office, and she asked me one day, she said, do you know anybody in prison? I thought, my God. I know more people who went to prison than went to college between the two. So we kind of sort of had this. But anyway, that's kind of the discussion about the playing field not being level and how people think that it is and sort of, but the piece I do on resiliency, I did a piece that came out in the Journal on Resiliency. Anybody in here read it? Okay, I'm glad I put it in the book then. But basically my critique of it is, I'm not, just adamant about resiliency, but what I always felt about resiliency was, it was that, sort of that we lined 100 kids up, hit them on the head with a baseball bat, found out which 5% did not have the expected outcome, that is a fractured skull or a knot on the head, and say, aha, we're going to make the other 95 like you 5. How are you guys able to withstand this trauma, this social injustice? And we're going to make the other kids like you. And that's how I feel. And my comment to that is, why does one need to be exceptional to live an ordinary life? It always bothered me. I was never a fan of it. Even though I understand why, but it causes us to take our eyes off the baseball bat. We're applauding ourselves in making people withstand social injustice. Why? No one's talking about resiliency for wealthy white kids. They're talking about resiliency for poor black and brown kids. So and my comment, hey, why they got to be so resilient? There are other questions. So anyway, the answer's in the book. Yeah, Mike.
Your comments made me think about sort of this issue of personal responsibility versus the macro level issues, the legacy of slavery that still have an effect on how people function and live their lives, particularly in communities of color, particularly among blacks or folks of African American descent. And so I wonder, even as a practitioner, how do you conceptualize, the issues that we commonly deal with that might hinge upon personal responsibility, yet how do you sort of comments about putting it in the sort of global or macro perspective to understand how a person may arrive at, certain situations that, they encounter.
Mike, you've asked a question, really a fundamental question. If there was but one theoretical theory I could have thought of, if my name was on just one theory, I wish it were on internal, external locus of control. It's Rotter's theory. I know you guys have all these theories, right? But Rotter's theories of internal, external control. Because Rotter's theory really is talking about free will and determinism. That's what it's really talking about. You have an internal, external locus of causation, is what he's really sort of talking about. Do you perceive the causation as being an internal function of you, or is it a function of sort of environmental sort of function? In social workers, one of the first studies I did when I got to WashU was with this. That I think we studied, I think Nolan and I did this study together. We did business people, social workers, and psychologists. And as you might imagine, it was on a continuum. The more social work there was business people who were the most internal, and the psychology people who were sort of middle range, and then the social workers who were most external. You see, if people are completely in control, it doesn't make sense to help them because they have elected their lives. You know, it gets into another. This is a pretty broader. I mean, it's really pretty. It's really free will and determinism. I mean, you know, damnation doesn't make sense either if you're not free. I mean, it really gets. This is a. I just love the whole thing. That's kind of what we're fighting about. That's kind of, to some extent, even what the Republicans are fighting about. They're fighting about other kinds of things too. But kind of, you know, where is the person's responsibility? You know, and people obviously aren't completely controlled. You do have some measure of freedom. You can do some things. At the same time, you're not completely free either. I critique this in the chapter on. I talk about this in the chapter on. You know, anybody in prison. The right will often say things like, well, you know, if you really want it, you can get it. It's out there for you. Let's get your behind out there and put your boots on and go out. You can achieve whatever you want. Meanwhile, they send their kids to private schools, monitor them, monitor their friends, monitor the social clubs they're in, monitor where they spend all their time. I mean, if it's so free, you know, just throw your kid out there and let him take his chances. He's going to be fine. You don't believe that. They monitor everything, where that kid goes to school, who that kid's friends are, who the parents of the kid's friends are, where he spends his summer time. I mean, no, so they don't believe it either. But it's one that they say you should be responsible. I don't know, you know, it's a hard thing to say, but their piece, of course, is to argue that, even though they're hypocritical, they don't really believe that. But you have to believe that you have to do, whether you're free or not. This is the issue I had in philosophy. I was taking some philosophy courses about free will and determinism. And, you know, it's kind of what we decide. But social workers, you guys clearly believe in external. You're clearly external. Otherwise, why help someone who's chosen poverty? They've chosen poverty. You know, that's why you see the death penalty and religiosity together, to go off and further with this, is that it makes sense that if I believe you are free as an agent to engage in good or bad, and you engage in good and bad, then you should get what's coming to you, which may be the death penalty. If I believe that, in fact, yeah, some of them are responsible, but you never grew up in a decent environment. You never had other than criminal parents. You grew up in foster care. You were abused. Like, you know, you sort of say there are also these mitigating circumstances that, yeah, but it isn't all your fault. Then you don't have it. But that's a good question for that. But that's why I really like the Rotter stuff. If I could have had one concept, I'd love to have had a Rotter, because that's really the biggie. That's really the one that's underneath all the other stuff that the Republicans are sort of saying, you know, your responsibility. But they want to say in some respects it's responsible because they don't want to assume responsibility. They want you to, you know, they like to think that I am wealthy because I am wealthy, and to ignore the fact that I'm wealthy because someone left me 10 million or 5 million, or someone gave me something in school, or someone I had, you know, very, very intact environment. You know, and again, I say they'll point somebody out who had, you know, really hard upbringing. And they'll say, see, he did it. Yeah, right. 1 out of 1,000 people make it. And you sort of say, well, he did it. He hit the lottery. Why don't you? Other comments? Yes, sir.
So, if you don't mind, if you just say your name and your affiliation to the school, that would be sure. Yes. I'm Robert Hawkins. I'm the Assistant Dean and Director of the Undergraduate Program.
Yeah, I saw your name outside, Robert.
Oh, yeah, it is a picture, too.
Yeah. That's how I recognize you, yeah.
But I thank you for this. This is great. And a lot of people know I talk about this topic all the time. But I'd like to get your take on this. So when you talk about the odds of you being here, and the odds of you being in the position that you're in, often the response is that, you know, if we focus on winning the lottery, if we focus on sort of the struggle, then we are teaching victimhood, and you know, instead of focusing on the resilience and the language of it. This is something that actually comes up in social work a lot, is because when we talk about the struggle that blacks have gone through, some people focus on, well, that's victimhood, but then so So
That's right. The reason we refer to fund resilience is because that puts the onus back on the client.
So I just wanted to hear some thoughts.
Well, no, basically that's in a nutshell. That's why it's easier to do that. It's easier to get things funded. It's easier to get more funding for that because you're really consistent with the political zeitgeist of the time. I mean, it's kind of like, we want personal responsibility, and responsibility is you to get that hit as hard as you can because you can do it. We can get that hit hard for you, rather than sort of saying we're gonna take this baseball bat off you a little bit. We're gonna make the neighborhood a lot so you don't have to face so many bullies. You don't have we have a program at Pitt, which one of our faculty members, John Wallace, runs. You have the granddaddy here, of course, Harlem Children's Zone. But we have a home of Children's Village in Pittsburgh. But it's the same thing, And I had to convince John of this through a lot of arguments, really, that people used to want to make the teachers. I wrote an op-ed and it was called "Don't Blame the Teachers." Actually, it should have been just don't blame the teachers, blame somebody else too. But that it's part of so much of what's wrong with the educational system is outside the school. We should be the major players. We have a program now in education in social work. We should be the major players in education. Because what happens, the problems manifest themselves in the classroom, but they originate outside the classroom. I mean, there's variance, there's obviously some kids don't write well and some kids need some help and they don't read so well, they wouldn't. But some kids, but most of what Jeffrey Canada spends his money on is factors external to the school. I mean, you're in college, baby college, there's tutelage, there's health care, there's mental health care. But I don't want to run from this topic that you raised. I don't know if I kind of answered it enough. It is a problem about where you. I never buy this idea about the victim thing. I never buy that. Black folks have been victims. So I don't buy this thing. Well, you want to be, yes, you're exactly right. So now you free somebody at this time and sort of say, so that's why the chapter on it's a chapter in there called Why Can't Blacks Be Like Immigrants? Which sometimes people will make, they'll say, what, other groups have come. They'll say even other, sometimes even other non-white groups, like people from Africa or Asia or someplace will come and they do well. And my critique of that is that I give about 5 reasons why. It's not a good comparison with India. I'll just give this one that captures it well for this group. If we took this group, and I said, listen, we're all going to be deported when this is over, and we're only going to go to this country, some poor country someplace, only with the money you have in your pocket. Now, Michael probably has a couple thousand in his pocket. He'd be all right. He'd be all right for a while. But most of us don't have so much. But in a relatively short period of time, short period being a decade or so, we would be infinitely better off than the indigenous poor than the country we went to. Because we have tremendous human capital. We know how to do things. You've seen businesses run. You have an idea how to keep a city together. You could teach, you could write, you could run a small business. You're literate, you have an idea. Most immigrants come here with empty pockets, but not with empty heads. They were something somewhere. They were plugged in somewhere. They were artisans, they were tailors, they were seamstresses, they were plumbers. They did something someplace. Now, true enough, the country went to hell and they had to leave. But they didn't leave what they knew how to do with them. So they come. That's one group. That's the main thing that immigrants come with. That most of them come in, they come knowing some of them are completely illiterate, but you can bet that's a small percent of the people. Most of them know how to do diamond cut. They know stuff. Also, there's other thing too, the reason that's a grossly unfair comparison. I mean, there are things like motivation, and there are things like they're also intact. They know who they are. They're Syrians or Bosnians, or they have some sense of identity as to who they are. So that's a piece that the paper ran. It's a piece that you can read it, but it really, I haven't gotten very many, in fact, I haven't gotten any critiques of that. I got some people who, I get, as you might imagine, interesting mail. Yes. Okay.
I just wanted to just point out some of the dynamics actually in the room that are kind of fascinating to me. I'm going to single out Janine, even though she's going to help me later. But Janine would never ask the first question in our PSW class, but yet she felt comfortable enough here to do so, which is obviously something interesting.
Because she can see I'm attracted to her.
In addition, you also kind of notice when you say something that might be particularly insightful, all the white folks are nodding their head like, yes, we're on the right side of this, so we agree with you. And I just want to know kind of your thoughts on just how that works, how these kind of little subtle or idiosyncratic kind of I don't want to call it racism, but just conceptions of race and how that plays a role amongst even us.
I've become more macro as I've gotten older. But I'm really a small group theorist. I'm really a micro trained person. I'm really trained in group work and like the book that's Race and Class is Individual, the book I wrote on black and singles, individual stuff, so dyadic interactions. The stuff I wrote was on individual. So I'm very comfortable with, in fact, that's what I was supposed to know, really. But I become more interested in macro things as I've gotten older. No, I do. There are differences, which is why sometimes I used to travel 100,000 miles a year some years doing diversity training, all kinds of places. I started off doing little military things for units in the town, and then I started doing for the country for the military, and then I started doing corporations, Chrysler, Mutual of New York things, and I quit when I became dean. Also, I get tired of it. On the road, it's okay, you're out there. But the one benefit you did get, though, is you got a lot of experience with questions. And you get people, and it calls you to ask questions, and then you have to sometimes, you have to think about them. So, but you do get difference. This would be really an unpleasant thing to give if it weren't for the racial diversity in this class, in this room. It just doesn't play well. And sometimes I find myself, I get invited to some place, and it's all white people. I don't know, it just doesn't have the chemistry to feed off each other a little bit. But I wish I had, I think I could design I don't know what it would look like. 3-day workshop. I used to do 3-day workshops. But I'd like to divide you guys up. You see, we covered a lot of ground. We talked about macro something, and then we talked about practice one-on-one. There's a lot of ground in there. But you'll find a lot of it's the same, though, because the theory is coming through all of them. Yeah, you do get some differences. And then like a place like job like this, or you come in, people sometimes you can't go to the bathroom because people will say to you, well, I didn't want to ask you up there, but now, So you don't get a break, period. You bathroom break, forget it. As soon as you go to the bathroom, somebody says, I didn't want to ask you. So it's a chance. I created, your dean this morning spoke to me about an exercise I created. I created this exercise, 20 years ago, more than that, a lot more than that. But it was from the book, Everything You Want to Know About Sex But We're Afraid to Ask, right? Well, I created an exercise called Everything You Want to Know About Race But We're Afraid to Ask. And essentially, I would take a group, this size, this would be a perfect size for it, and ask you to write down your most ridiculous racial question. Here's your chance. And I would always start off by saying, what they say about black men, yes, it's true. Now we got that one out of the way. Now that we got that one out, People write down, but you know what? That's just, you'd be surprised. Even though I led with that, I still get those kind of questions. But people write them down. And then we go through them and answer them. And they're just questions. Where would you learn this stuff? You know, I said this about CSW, about GAID, that I was always struck how when I came out of school, of course, it was called 1, 2, 3, 4A. Basically the same stuff. It was called diversity training. Diversity content should be in all the courses. But it's required that we all of us being faculty members, teach it, right? We had to teach this to our students. But it wasn't required that we be taught it as doctoral students. So here we had this major issue that we wanted our students to go out and prepare the world, teach people, but we weren't taught it ourselves. So then you get on the faculty someplace and you say, hey, teach this content, and they balk. And you wonder why. They balk because they don't know it. Why would I want to go teach something I don't know? They don't know how to teach it. They're uncomfortable with it. They don't know basic questions about it. You know, so they're inadequate, and we keep doing it. Yeah.
Larry, I'd like to hear your thoughts about political correctness and the extent to which it kind of mitigates and potentially racism.
Well, you know, I hear Trump, of course, has a lot to say about that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it's like anything else. It probably has some curvilinear function. I mean, at some point, it's probably a good thing. At some point, if you can't say anything, it's a bad thing. How can you tell grandma she shouldn't eat so much rather than calling her just fat? I mean, that kind of thing. But you need to tell grandma not to eat so many of those cookies, you know. So the race thing, you know, how do you broach it? And, you know, some of it's finesse. You know, I don't know, we could draw a line and sort of say this, you know, you can't talk about this and you shouldn't talk about that. But it's also, people will forgive you for most faux pas if they believe one thing. You don't mean them harm. So what I would say to you with your clients, that first one of the three, that do they perceive you as being a person of goodwill, that you can talk, and also remember something else, that non-white clients are much more comfortable talking about race than a white therapist. They live it every day. They're talking about it every day. You are more unique to them than they are, I mean, they are to you than you are to them. They have white people all day. Either white teachers, white insurance men, white plumbers, white TV repair guys. So it's not uncommon. So what's unique is for you to have this black person or Hispanic person. That's what you need. So you're more, I talk about this someplace, in an early article, it's probably in the book, probably in that book, early, long time ago. We used to talk about the dyads. I'm sure it must be in that book. You know, but mainly you want to have, the person will forgive your fault, and you got to make them. You got to make them. You know, I think people would like to hide behind not making them. What has been the deal in the past is that the therapist would not say anything, and the client would not say anything, and they both would hope they could get out of the room before either of them had to say anything. Right? But it's always important. The talk I gave again in Washington, talking about data, that, for example, I think the analogy I gave there was poor and poor. If you had a white person and a white poor person and a black poor person, they're not equal. Phenomenon is not the same. So your data would look okay. Your data would sort of say, well, yeah, we control for income, but you certainly haven't control for stigma. And to be a black poor person is very different than a white poor person. If no more than the fact that most white people are not surrounded by other poor white people. Most black people are surrounded by other poor black people. So I mean, it's a very different thing. So, but to your point, I would err on the other side. I wouldn't hide behind the fact that, well, you know, I want to be, I'm worried about being politically correct or not. You know. Yes.
Hi, my name is Keisha White. I work for the New York City Department of Health. I'm applying to the DSW program. And I work in communications. And one of the things that we do right now is with our new commissioner, Dr. Bassett, Dr. Mary Bassett, she's really focusing on health equity. A lot of times we're trying to figure out how do we, and right now I'm in the Division of Mental Hygiene, we have a couple of things on deck. One of them is we want to do a media campaign that speaks to Black and Latino youth, particularly males, about what it's like to live as Black males and how Black and Latino males and how does that impact their mental health. And so when I'm thinking about like how do you communicate these types of things when we're wanting people to think about themselves as just humans, just people, like just being at peace, being able to, you know, deal and cope with life, you know. And at the same time, we're grappling with this big issue of like life imposes these significant challenges on them. And we don't want to do an outward-facing campaign that might create even more problems because we've identified a target population and speaking to some of their unique challenges. And I've just been really, you know, even with some of my clients, I've really been thinking about how do I get to the essence of affirming a Black male when I know and I've seen so often the systematic challenges that they experience. And even in my role, even my very own role, I'm experiencing where my supervisor is a Black male is under such pressure that him himself is not even able to fully function as a person, intellectually contributing to the conversation that will provide, you know, a media campaign for 8.7 million people that speaks to the serious challenges. And I've just grappled with this. Like, I want to acknowledge that you are a person. You have to have feelings. You know, you're a man. You have hopes. You have responsibilities. But I also want to speak to. I want to also acknowledge that this racism thing, and I want to be sensitive to it. And I wonder, like, I'm listening to it. I'm thinking, like, how do we deal with that? How do I make a message so significant, targeted, and at the same time affirm their humanity, but at the same time speak to the injustice? You know,
I don't know if I have the answer to that. I'd say something that, you know, before I became friends with Julian Bond. He came to the Race in America conference. He was the inaugurator of the center, and I talked to him, and he too was surprised at how he had fought this all his life, and he was still fighting some of the same battles. Kenneth Clark, who was here somewhere, was really my model too. I want to be Kenneth Clark. But Kenneth Clark died depressed about the state of things. You have someone, Julius Wilson, who's still around. These are psychologists and sociologists people. But the point is, is that some time ago, not too terribly long ago, I don't know, 20 years maybe, I don't know, maybe longer than that, I realized that this problem would not be solved during my lifetime. I honestly thought it would be. I honestly believed when I was a student at the University of Michigan that we're going to solve this, baby. We'll do this. We have the know-how. We have, you know, we can do this. Society's changing, flower power, all the stuff going on at the time. You have to put yourself in some sort of context, some historical perspective, that you're in a struggle that's been going on a long time. This didn't start, you know, the history books in the schools sort of say, well, the country, Mayflower, something happened, and then there was slavery, and then there was a white guy named Lincoln freed the slaves, and then we're going on. You know. They don't talk about white people. A lot of white people did a lot of things long before Lincoln came along and freed the slaves because it was a contest between free labor and slave labor. Basically, they didn't want any more slave labor. So it's, it's this kind of a thing. You need to have some perspective of yourself a little bit. And you will have to do what you can do during your time. Sometimes I find that way. At times, I think I know a lot about race. I tell my friends this all the time. I tell my girlfriend this all the time. And other days, I feel like I don't understand it at all. I think this is ridiculous. But it's not ridiculous. A guy people ask me sometimes, and it's in one of the chapters, but it's about advantage. Someone asked me a question, why are we still dealing with this after all these years? Because there's still advantage to be had after all these years. It's always, the isms all over the world are about advantage. Who has the most cows? Who has the most women? Who has the most land? Who has the most prestige? And whatever means we can get it, we'll take it. People will use whatever means they can to exploit their neighbors. And it isn't limited to any group. No group is above it. Every group finds a way to justify. That's what amazed me about the slavery thing. Can you imagine you had a society for 246 years, everybody said, well, not everybody, but enough of them said slavery was okay. You couldn't go out there now and find, you'd be hard-pressed to find one person that said, should we enslave people? I said, no, we shouldn't enslave people. Millions of people said it was okay. Supreme Court, the Congress, they all went along with this. Everybody said this is okay. Not everybody, but the majority of people, they kept it in power. It didn't come out through legislation. I mean, it wasn't like people said, raise your hands and we'll get rid of it. No. I mean, this went on. People went along with this. I found out how long, I was trying to figure out how long the Nazis were in power, and I get a range on it, people talking about it a little bit, but they were in power for a relatively short period of time, not 2.5 centuries. So you can't just sort of say there's a group of radical bad guys that came in and we were bad guys and then we threw them out. No, you had a country that did this for a long, long time. The president of the country, presidents own slaves. This was okay. So the point I say to you is that it's hard to change a man's mind or a person's mind when they view it in their economic interest not to change it. So you just have to do what you can do and have some idea that this is a lifelong struggle for you. You'll never get, I doubt it'll be solved in your time. I'm sorry to bring you that bad news. I tell my sons the same thing, but I've raised them to be leaders in Black America. That's really the goal. I said, I don't mind you living well. You can live well. It's okay, but that's not the main thing I've raised you for. Your goal is to continue this fight. So I have 3 sons. Anybody need any dates, anything? They're good-looking kids.
And one of the areas of interest is trauma, particularly intergenerational trauma. And I have friends who write about and talk about post-slavery stress syndrome. And I'm just wondering, there's now so much literature about the brain and what happens in terms of trauma and how it carries over the generations. And I just wonder your views on that.
I don't really know much about that area of study. I really don't. I mean, I've always thought, yeah, it makes sense, but maybe I should read a little more and think about it. Certainly it makes sense,
It has tremendous implications. Also, there's some questions about it. At least I have questions about it. But it's an area I think we need to talk about more.
I tell my sons about, I have young sons. I have a 21-year-old, a 19-year-old, and an 18-year-old. 2 of them are interested in medicine. You maybe think about this a little bit. Anyway, yeah, but I tell them that, it will be, yeah, I mean, I don't know what to think about that in terms of being intergenerational. But I do tell them sometimes about choosing mates, and I'll think, and I believe this about mates. This is, people ask me why don't I write another book on Black and Single. A Black and Single book, we sold, like I said, we sold 50,000 copies the first year. But I learned, in terms of thinking about stuff about this, is that you don't have to go back very far. I mean, I don't want to get in arguments with people about, 200 years, can you still see it? You do still see it. But I don't. But even more, you can even do more than that, closer than that. And I tell my sons, I says, what she has seen is what you will get. And I believe that. That the world that she has seen. We don't like what the hip hoppers are saying because we don't like what they've seen. They're telling us what their world looks like, what their language looks like. We don't want to hear it. Yeah.
I have a question that gets back to your internal, external, and your importance of theory points, both of which what is your, you tend to continue to educate in social work from the framework of cultural competence. Some people use cultural humility. What do you think critical race theory has to offer us that might be an improvement?
I think about that. I hear people, some of the people who were original people for that were at Pitt for a while. I don't know what, that's one of the theories I think about. It's clearly a political one. I don't know. I don't know that. I really don't know. I've tried to read it, and I have the book on critical race theory, and I read the chapters, and I read it, and I can't. And I have even a student who sort of talks about it, and I really can't quite get my head around it to figure out how to use it. So I don't know. I'm sorry.
One of the differences is that critical race theory certainly talks about the need for structural change. And cultural competence doesn't particularly.
That one I told you, competence, I talk about the resilience. That says how do we do, in one case you talk about someone putting kids in the river and someone putting them out. Do you not get them? How did they get hit on the head first? Or how did they get in the river to begin with? Yeah, that's clearly something, and that's kind of our dilemma a little bit. It's kind of, you saw a bunch of kids in trouble. Do you help the ones in trouble now? Or do you try and go back upstream a little bit? You try and do them both, but clearly we need greater structural change. But it's going to be an interesting time. I mean, this political climate that we have, and the reducing of resources, and the number of minority people who are upset about immigrants, and the racial distribution of the country in general. You're going to hear more about this. I'm kind of curious where this is all going to pan out. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I'm very touched by your talk.
Oh, thank you.
I understand this is very affirming to me personally. My name is Yuli, I'm teacher, Southern Florida.
Nice to meet you.
Very inappropriate to get emotional, but I just feel very, very touched.
It's fine.
I ask my question later.
Okay.
Maybe I should ask you. Because I'm very interested in the cross-cultural practice. It's my life as a immigrant. I'm very much committed to work on this topic. But it's such a struggle with in the social work
education. And it just really get to me because I struggle so much, by teaching the content. I taught in practice in human behavior, religion, research, and now I'm teaching cultural diversity, in market practice, which is the courses I'm teaching for a number of years now. But such a struggle that is fundamentally our theoretical orientation, our principle of ethical principles. So are we relying on clinicians' experiential learning, through experiential learning to get that cross-cultural competency, or we pretend we could teach a cultural competency? And so we have such a, how do I say that, self-satisfaction on the job we are doing. It's a very painful to watch. And I have no answer. I have no answer to this systematic training. But I don't know how this could be ameliorated, it could be improved, because the course I'm teaching, I struggle and I want to make a difference, but it's daunting. It's daunting. And this, what you're talking today is really touches me.
Well, what you're talking about touches me. Thank you for your question. I think it's good. And I don't know, these things, if anyone sort of has a good thing. Cultural competence, I've always felt, we've changed the term over the generations. It was diversity training, it was cultural sensitivity, and it's cultural competence. But the bottom line is learning how to work with an increasingly different, diverse population. You're never going to learn everything. That book is probably the best thing we've done with that. That while that book is dated in some respects, the theory is still sound. The principles we talk about are still sound in it. That, you can't prepare a person for every particular group and certainly every scenario that might present itself. You can't do that. But there are some basic things. Like the three things I talked about are actually, I really should blow it up. I mean, in that sense, really talk about it a lot more. There are things that you can teach. That, establish this relationship. As I said to you, clients will forgive most of your faux pas if they believe you mean them well. So you won't know everything there is working about Japanese or Ghanaians or blacks or Puerto Ricans or Dominicans. There's no way to know all that. How can you possibly know all that? But there's some things about human behavior that you can learn, that basically I think it should be, highly structured in terms of what we sort of taught. And then understand that people will have to go and learn some of it. I mean, they can't, And they'll never learn it all either. They'll learn how to work with Dominicans, what the case might be or something. So don't beat yourself up that you don't know everything.
But that's not what my struggle is. It's not knowing the changing, constantly changing population. What I'm talking about is the assurance, the certainty of what we're teaching from a very much theoretical speaking, very much a Eurogenic theory. So that's how we have bought into it. That is it. That's what I'm talking about. And that is very hurtful for me to see. That's never questioned. I've been here for 40 years. It's never questioned. That's what really hurtful to see. The population is diversified. New York is an example, but the whole country is catching up.
That's right.
But we have not, in social work education, have a sense of our, main content and thrust of our country. So that's what I'm feeling like. Oftentimes, we, how do you say that, bandage, package, change, but we do not address the issue. We add a course, cultural diversity, we add a course. We talk about diversity population, but that's not the point. So how could we all meant well, but how could we be competent? We have to learn our competency through experience, and then that's fine.
These are the kind of, obviously, we're not going to answer the question in here. These are the kind of conversations that we need to have, around the table. I mean, or some small group of people. I mean, I don't know if anybody has the answer to it exactly as you're asking it.
We may not have the answer, but my point is we are not addressing.
You know, addressing it. Well, maybe we need to do that. I mean, that's why these things that's the reason I like to have people divide up into groups a little bit. Because practitioners, some people don't have that question, but some people might. Administrators probably think less about that. But, you know, and I don't know if we'll ever, you know, one thing I had to decide a long time ago about this business is that I'm very happy to say what I don't know, because I feel I know a lot of stuff. I really do. And so I know stuff, so I don't mind saying that I don't know something. And the things you're talking about are the kind of, that's the kind of thing we might have at some, I'd say NAT or something, I don't know, maybe not. But that's the kind of discussion that you have. You know, you write that someplace and you have this dialogue and it goes through the country. And people will critique it and say, no, that's not it, this is it. But you raised the question. You're raising the question. And that's what maybe has to happen. Maybe that's what your contribution is, to at least raise the question. That may be the kind of thing that, you know, someone has, you have at CSWE, you have some dialogue. But you're unlikely to answer it in this forum. But I think it's one that you should write about and think about. And stay with it. Maybe that's your contribution to the profession. There was a question back there. Someone had their hands up and I didn't raise them. Yes.
As far as like training social workers and social work education, going from this idea of diversity and inclusion and cultural sensitivity to real anti-racism work and bringing activism into the classroom as part of training. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that switch, because I haven't experienced that directly in the classroom.
Yeah, well, we have historically not done so much with activism. I mean, you know, one of the things I like to talk to you about, and that is policy. I've become also fascinated with policy now. There's a policy, some of you know, there's a big policy group in New York that's doing stuff. It's here in New York. It's Manhattan. I'm on it. It's a board. I'm on it. But it's saying that there's just not enough to sort of do these things, you know, to find the research or whatever it is, but to engage in policy, to engage in more advocacy. So yeah, all these things are happening now more. But whether you're a program, you know, I'd be curious about. You have an interesting degree. You said your master's program, you did a DSW program. Yeah, that's more traditional. But that's right. Well, that's why we've had these schisms called macro and micro. Because some people, what I find with students, what I think happens to students, I think students come in interested in micro, and as they get older, they become interested in macro, but they were trained in micro. So now their interests in their knowledge base are kind of out of it, which would be a great place to introduce people to come back to school to get a macro education, or macro and policy, or something, we call it something. I think about myself, I wasn't interested in macro at all when I was a student.
We're coming to a close. I know that there's a few questions. So after that, you're going to be able to have an opportunity to informal conversation over some refreshments. And right after those two questions, Dean Lynn Vedeklich is going to come back up to close this out, okay? Yes.
My name is Meredith Reardon. I'm a part of the DSW program. And when you were talking about the idea of do no harm with the client, where there's a difference noted in place, you know, as long as you have a feeling that the client has a feeling that you're not intentionally trying to harm them. It seems also, and you said this, that you're not afraid to say what you don't know. And humility might be playing a big part in that too. And I was noticing that through your whole talk. You approach, you know,
Well, there are more flattering ways to do that, but I do it that way. I mean, you probably thought of being smarter if you give some answer even if it's incorrect. But yeah, no, you just, you know, and I think the client will buy that. You say, you know, I don't really know how that works, but you and I can, you're never going to match up, right, with everybody. Different race, different whatever it is. But you say to the client something like, you know, I don't really know I will never know as much about being female as you are, right, as you do. But I think with your help, we can work on this problem. We can figure some things out. No, I don't know the answer to that, but you and I can figure it out together, I think. And that's kind of my answer to this problem too. That, you know, that's kind of, we had scripted that. We'd scripted that, you know, there's a video that we made 20 years ago. We didn't finish, we made just one, but it just does that. It says what to do with the client when the client says something. And it was exactly that, you know, that we don't know, you know, I don't know. I can see. One of the things that you want to do with a client like that, though, is it's obvious anybody can tell there's a difference between you and I, right? Okay, and I'm the therapist here, client. I can see that. But what I need to look for immediately is similarity. So you know those glasses you had on? I used to have something like that. In fact, I had some on like this morning. I broke them and didn't wear them, so that's why I don't have them on, and you got yours on. That's far-fetched. But yeah, right, whatever it is. But so I don't know in terms of, you know, obviously you just won't have an answer for all these things, you know, and you be prepared for them, and you just sort of tell people, said, you know, I don't know, we can work this out, you know, I'll give you the best of my knowledge, and I know people, you and I you can figure out whatever this gender issue you're having, we'll work it out, we'll find somebody. So it's the unit that you really want, but people rarely hire the most competent person for a job. He or she isn't often liked well enough. You really want to make sure that your absence of knowledge can really be enhanced by your rapport. So what you want to do is sustain a client with you long enough for you to find the answer. That's why in hostage situations, they want the client, they want the hostage guy and the victim to stay in contact as long as they can. The longer you're in contact with someone, the less likely you are to harm them, right? So what you want to do with clients is the same thing. You want to play for time. So you don't know how to solve it this week, you know. You're this white woman, and I know you think this black guy, I'm a little strange, and I am, but we can work on this. So come back next week, and I'll see what I can find about it. Huh? Otherwise, what I tell people is I can increase your probabilities of client dropout. And if you're in business, I'd say I can increase your probabilities of corporate success, because basically the principles are the same. You really want to have fewer lawsuits. You want to have more clients who like you. The dynamic is the same. So keep that client in the room with you and figure out the problem.
And when I was listening to you speak about slavery as a past context, I wanted to engage you about how we get the field enlarged to kind of see that snapshot in time as underpinning all of the systems that we have right now, especially as it pertains to some of the inner city populations, African American populations specifically. And I say that because in the practicum I'm in right now, I'm situated in the UN complex, and there's always these conversations at a macro level about trauma. Is it the big T or the little T? Are you running from a war, or do you live in inner city Chicago? And I think often our situations are looked at as a very small T, and that's why people have the intermingling of you've not pulled yourself up, or it's victimhood. How can we as social workers advocate for Black narratives to really be seen in the context of the big T of trauma?
You know, America has a very dastardly history. One day they're going to dig it up, and they're going to realize that we committed genocide against Native Americans. Straight up. We killed them off, shot them off, gave them poison blankets. We killed them off. You know? And then they're going to look at it and they're also going to say, well, we carried out the most egregious form of slavery the world has ever seen. And we did it for 2.5 centuries. America is just beginning to even talk about slavery. You have a couple movies in the last year. In the last year, you probably had 4 that were just bringing this up. You know, you had 12 Years a Slave, you had Lincoln, you have Django, which is kind of strange. You have, but still it was talking about slavery, right? But it was because why would What always bothers me about I would be more sensitive to the right if they would acknowledge bad things when they happen. You know, if a cop shoots somebody in the back, they should stand up and say, hey, we're against that. They just won't say anything. If they view it, a comment to me I feel about them is that they have a lot to say about reverse discrimination, but have been silent on discrimination. You know? So they say, well, we don't like reverse discrimination. We want to go back to time one. You know? So it's hard. It's a hard sell. What you're trying to do is you're trying to sell a discussion that people don't really want to have. You know. Because people will say, well, my parents owned slaves, but people benefited from it. You know, blacks really didn't do much with the land rushes. Blacks didn't do much with, you know, the GI Bill. I mean, blacks, you know, do much even with the housing. So I mean, you know, Social Security. I didn't realize that until we had Snagel. What's his name? When affirmative action was white. Spitznagel. It's not Spitznagel. That's the research. That's a statistician at WashU. Anyway, some kind of Katznagel. But basically talking about the reason they were able to get the South to go along with Social Security was to let it be in the hands of the states. That otherwise we won't do this, and we'll let the states decide who should get the GI Bill. And as a consequence, most of the blacks at that time lived in the South, so they didn't do so well with the GI Bill, which is one of the biggest transfer of wealth, you know, in the country for a long time. So you have these discussions. I mean, but you have to remember that people don't really want to, you know, everyone likes to think they are where they are. Kind of this free will and determinism business again, because of their, you know, they got here. You know, I came here, and you know, I get people say, well, my parents came here, you know, and we've done well. Well, yeah, you've done well. Your parents own property. My parents still can't own the property in that neighborhood. So, you know, it's that kind of dialogue that's uncomfortable. So it's uphill. But I think it's your duty to have that, to force that conversation. But do it in a way that's, you know, it's kind of hard to tell you how to do that. It requires a certain tact. But we want to have this, I don't mean you harm, but we need to talk about this, you know. And that still is affecting people, you know. They came up from the Great Migration. Largely, my parents came from Alabama, from where this picture was taken. This is an interesting story, by the way, about my mom and that family. Came with the Great Migration in the 40s to Michigan. But, you know, it wasn't, I'm just old enough to have missed Jim Crow, really. You know, I'm old enough to have caught some of it, I guess. I caught a little bit of it. I was talking to friends last night at dinner, and in the town I'm from, the man is he and I are both in the same town. And we wouldn't have known each other as kids because the town was segregated. But I didn't really know it so much because I wasn't old enough. You don't really notice it until you get old enough to try to go to the hotel. Like he talked about a hotel that I couldn't have stayed in, but I didn't go to the hotel. What would I care about it? We talked about a swimming pool. Blacks had this little bit of swimming pool, and whites had a nice swimming pool. But we didn't care. It was a black swimming pool, and it was very hip, so we didn't mind staying there. So, you know, so it was, you know, some of these dialogues. But I could see, but then at the same time, I was young enough now that I benefited from the civil rights movement. That I came along just right. The protests, King's movements, the South, 64, 65, college, and opened up in the 70s, opportunities in the 80s, I hit it just right. And then we get a pushback with it, and then close the door again. So you're having a pipeline that's sort of problematic, and you had a economy. The economy I talked about, that manufacturing economy, really disproportionately affected black people. Where I'm from, it's a ghost town now. I'm from the town Saginaw, which is 20 miles north of Flint. Same kind of scenario. But, you know, those people, so many, when I was joking about I'm the only one of my friends who graduated from high school. I mean, it just, you know, I didn't know things. As an adult, I look back on it, and things that I took for granted, I realize now were really quite biased. But I didn't know. I was just this kid, and I thought, Have any of you ever read Jonathan Cazot's Death at an Early Age? Jonathan Cazot's written books since that time. He's written Savage Inequalities and some other things. Well, his first book was a book called Death at an Early Age in the Boston School System. I read this book, Death at an Early Age. I had to keep reminding myself that he wasn't talking about my school. It's just terrible. But I didn't know any better. I thought, isn't this hard? Don't everyone beat their kids? So I thought, it's that kind of an idea, You don't know that you're in a bad family until you go someplace else. So anyway, it's your job to keep up the struggle. Is that the last one?
No. This isn't going to last too long, but we want to just take this moment to give you a small token of our appreciation. This is Professor Alma Carton. She couldn't be here today, and she's so sorry. Her newest book, called The Reflections on the American Social Welfare State, the collected papers of James Dobson. And I want to thank you, Larry. I'm just going to read a very short quote and thank Larry for exemplifying the ideals that Jim Dobson really represents to the profession and to New York in particular, where he was a government leader as well as a dean of Fordham University. And Jim Dobson really cared about creating a caring society. And a caring society has a responsibility to plan fully in the short and long term to build a society in which there is an equitable distribution of goods and services to guarantee equal access to basic necessities for all members. And the kind of dialogue and the kind of work and analysis you're doing, we think makes a significant contribution to moving our society in this direction. So thank you so much, Larry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I do him.
And I'll make no secret about it to this group, and maybe some of you will support me. Trying to encourage Larry to think about spending his next sabbatical here at NYU. If you like that idea, give it a applause.